Welcome everybody to the CSCA Montreal chapter, and our talk being led by Cory Labrecque about Death Shall Have No Dominion, Science, Transhumanism, and Christianity in the Pursuit of Immortality. So the CSCA is a Christian organization of scientists and those people who are interested in science. It's an affiliation of many different branches of science and philosophy and theology. And Montreal has a chapter, and I'm the chapter lead, but the committee also contains Roy Hoffman and Maria Al-Kayad. If you are interested in it, there is a blog that you can participate in. There's an emailing list that you can put yourself under, or you can just contact me. And I can put you on those places as well, but you can also find us on YouTube or Instagram or Facebook. So I would like to introduce Cory to you. Cory Andrew Labrecque is professor of Bioethics and Theological Ethics and the inaugural chair of Educational Leadership in the Ethics of Life at the Faculty of Theology and Religion Studies at the Université Laval in Quebec City, where he is vice dean and director of graduate programs in theology. Cory is a corresponding member of the Pontificate Academy for Life, which counsels the Vatican on ethical issues in medicine, biotechnology, and the environment.
So it's great to be with you. I often present to large crowds, so being with a small group is actually a delight. You know, there's some intimacy there, and we can have some good exchange following the conversation today. So thank you for the invitation, Joseph. It's wonderful to be here. So today, what I'd like to do is take a little, maybe a little tour, as we might say, of the science of aging and look into ageism and transhumanism as conduits to think about Christianity and Christian longings for longevity, which was the subject of my doctoral thesis now too many years ago, right? That is now being transformed into a book. But it's been of great interest to me. And you'll see once I present, maybe if you're new to transhumanism, you'll see why, as I present it, why Christian theologians have been particularly interested, and Christian scientists have been interested in this particular philosophy. So let's move our way there. So just to give you some background for those of you interested in the science of aging, it's actually a really convoluted, like everything in science, I suspect. It's a convoluted, very complex thing, and it's actually quite difficult to pin down, as you can imagine, right? There's so many layers to what it means to age, certainly biologically, that in science, there's lots of disagreement there. And most theories that we have around why we age seem to address one particular feature of the aging process rather than the whole of it. But let me just give you some ideas that are usually floated around in the sciences, at least in mainstream science. So very often when we speak about the science of aging at the molecular level, we talk about, forgive this, now I'm being heady perhaps, right? But we talk about the systemic random loss of molecular fidelity that occurs over an extended period of time after reproductive success, right? That exceeds the body's ability to repair and therefore increases our susceptibility to disease. Are you with me? So it's the molecules stop being faithful to each other, right? Stop the binding process and they kind of fall away. And because of that, there's a susceptibility to disease. There are others, of course, that highlight other parts of what happens within the body that might contribute to the aging of the organism. Maybe, I'm sure many of you know of this, so forgive me, but we can talk about oxidative damage. So even though about free radicals, which are the byproduct of cellular metabolism, they serve important roles, right, in the body for immune response and cell communication. They are highly reactive, though, and if they're not intercepted by antioxidants, they can cause a considerable amount of damage to the cell, especially to the mitochondria, right, which are the powerhouses of the cell. And a number of features of the aging process and of aging, such as increased vulnerability to disease and compromised functionality, they've been linked to oxidative damage of the mitochondria. And so some people say, why don't we just intervene with that? The problem is when you intervene to prevent all of this from happening, then you counter the benefits of free radicals to begin with the immune process. So it's kind of a tricky thing. For those of you who did genetics in your or have genetics in your background, you certainly have genetics in your biological background, but in your educational background, you will have learned of something called telomeres, right? When I was a student, I remember in biology, and this happened in certainly in high school, CEGEP, and in university as well. We were always told that telomeres, or the way that it was talked about, is that telomeres are to be thought of as the caps of the chromosomes at either end, right? Kind of like a shoelace that has those two plastic tips, right, to keep the shoelace from unraveling. The telomeres are often thought about just like that. They are on either side of the chromosome to ensure the stability of the chromosomes and to prevent their degradation as the cells replicate over and over and over. And for most cells, the length of the telomeres decrease with every division until eventually they become too short to maintain the integrity of the chromosome, and then they enter kind of an aging phase. And some people think that's organismal in some ways too, that it reaches the organismal level. But at the same time, most normal human cells contain an enzyme called telomerase, right? Telomerase, which has the ability to restore telomeres during cell division. But it's usually, telomerase is usually quiescent under normal conditions. And too active telomerase expression is largely accountable for the longer lifespans of cancer cells. So it's not something that, again, that gets really tricky. Stem cells and so on and so forth, which, as you know, replicate incessantly without the aging effect of telomeres that's shortened. Are you all with me? So that's been kind of tricky to kind of explore that particular angle, which is a popular one, certainly in the sciences of aging. Another, theory that's often talked about is the one called caloric restriction, which means exactly as it says. This is, a number of studies kind of correlate a calorie restricted diet. Now, I'm not talking about malnutrition, right? Because you can restrict calories to the extent that you're malnourished, and that's not going to help, right? As we can well understand. And some people are some studies are showing a correlation between caloric restricted diets without malnutrition with a delayed onset of age changes. Right, this is maybe not new to you. I suspect this is not new to you. It's often in the media, right? Often the media will pick up with that. And we know that this is the case, especially if there's some initiation of that calorie restriction before late adolescence. And it considerably extends the mean and the maximum lifespan of worms and of mice. You know how this is in animal studies. And then we ask the question, what would this mean in human studies? But all kinds of studies on human, there are studies, of course, on this on humans and non-human primates, which have, not surprisingly, shown reduced risk for diabetes and atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease, and therefore kind of delaying the onset of aging. But people are wondering, is it because it's staving off certain diseases that are associated with aging and so on and so forth? So kind of tricky overall, but I just want to impress on you this idea that there's a certain complexity in the sciences of aging in terms of, and a certain disagreement in the science of aging in terms of how this all happens. It is quite well known, I think, especially in Canada, but we know this, that in the world, and it's quite comparable here in our country, that by the year 2030, which is on our doorstep, 1 in 6 people, if not 1 in 5, some studies are projecting, in the world will be aged 60 and over. That's a large percentage of the population, right? And people are calling it the graying of the global demographic. And what that means for us, right, as baby boomers have come in to a certain level of age, and what this means in terms of access to healthcare, which the Christian churches have been incredibly interested in terms of access and social justice questions. But what's interesting is that as our populations age quite substantially, we're doing so in an anti-aging society, right? In a society that's incredibly ageist. And it's not just ageist in terms of our culture. We've inherited ageism, right? It's in our literature, it's in our common culture, and so on and so forth. Just let me give you some examples, not to pinpoint ageism on William Shakespeare, but some of you have studied Shakespeare perhaps, and you'll remember that famous play called As You Like It. That's the one that has that passage, all the world's a stage. Do you know that famous line? And in it, he goes about talking about the 7 ages of humankind: the baby, the toddler, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when he gets to the last age, this is how he describes it, right? The aged, this is how he describes it. Last scene of all that ends this strange, eventful history is second childishness and mere oblivion, without teeth, without eyes, without taste, without everything. Not my vision of aging, but it is captured. And I'm not saying that this is, captured in all of literature, but we have them, right, pocketed throughout some of our learnings as we move through, which forms, I think, a certain vision of ageism, certainly in our culture. But you need only go to, Hallmark, to see how it's also invested in popular culture. How many times have you gone to a greeting card store, right? Forgive me, Hallmark or anything else, right? To a greeting card store to pick up a greeting card for someone. So many of the cards are just dripping of ageism. And I'm not just talking about the cards, in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Even like, I was picking up a card the other day for my nephew who was turning 24. And on it, the cake had 24 candles, and there were fire engines on the card, people trying to put out the fire, talking about how old this person is, that is causing such a havoc. This view of aging as being something that you really want to avoid. In fact, it's dangerous, that idea. This one I had picked up a while ago for my mom, who is now no longer with us. But, I got her this card. Another birthday. Well, look in the mirror. Do you see wrinkles? Do you see gray hairs? Of course you don't. And inside it says, your eyesight's gone. Happy birthday, Mom, I wrote, and was almost crucified for that card. Now, I can say that as a Christian scholar, so I think we're okay. Just another one I that I had seen and picked up and didn't dare give to anyone because I'd learned my lesson. But, this one, 50, and I'm approaching this age, right? So I have to be very, very, now I'm like, yikes. But this one says, you're 50, and in the card, it reads, but you look so natural and lifelike. Could you imagine? Happy birthday, friend. Who thinks that this is the right way to go about these things? But again, and I'm clearly cherry picking, right? I'm picking some examples of ageism in our culture, but it is everywhere, right? It is really everywhere. Walk down a pharmacy aisle and tell me if you don't see the impacts of the anti-aging kind of project. And we'll get to that. We'll get back to that in a second. I find this helpful, this quote here, quite helpful from Butler. Ageism reflects a deep-seated uneasiness on the part of the young and middle-aged, a personal revulsion to and distaste for growing old, disease, disability, which are often all conflated, and a fear of powerlessness, uselessness, and death. A lot of my work is in the context of medical aid in dying, of ethical issues at the end of life, especially in the aging context. And the number of times I've heard a patient of a certain age to say, who would say something like, I don't want to be a burden on my family. And this is not just of the aging population. We hear this time and again. And I'm sure you've heard this at home as well, right? Not far from home, where somebody says, if I become a burden, then, and then there's a discussion that might or might not happen afterwards. But there is that, I think that's part of the ageist culture, is that you see this linking, and this has always been problematic for the Christian traditions, this linking of your dignity and your function. And so when you lose your function, you lose your dignity, right? Which is contrary to all Christian teaching. And I say that with all generalization, but I say that with accuracy as well. Do you follow me? This idea that you lose your function, then you also lose your dignity. So let's make sure that you don't lose one so that you lose the other. In the Christian traditions, it's always been understood that dignity is intact, right? Sealed on all humans by virtue of the image of God, right? That's something that's never lost. Now, people may no longer treat you with dignity. That's something different. But in terms of dignity being intact, even though you might lose your cognitive prowess, or because you might lose certain functions, that's something I think that that clings very closely to the Christian tradition, and it becomes almost countercultural. So aging, as a reminder of mortality, gives it, of course, this negative kind of connotation. Look at this from sociologists Nancy Harding and Colin Palfrey, that the aging body is feared, for it shows that all humankind's investment in the body, medically, technologically, so on and so forth, is ultimately useless. Now, that might be true, although I wouldn't put this over my, my research lab door, or, over a hospital door, for instance. But there is this notion, of course, that aging is a herald of mortality, makes it something, makes it just this inevitable chapter of decline. That's often the vision that we see. And it's very transhumanist, in fact. And I'll get back to that in a second. It doesn't help, of course, that aging is often pathologized, right? Why? Because it's often synonymized, if I may, or made synonymous with degenerative disease, because it's a major risk factor of it. But then people will conflate it. Have you ever heard people call Alzheimer's disease old timers? I mean, the number of times I've heard that, it makes my skin crawl, right? It's because there's this kind of ageist vision that says, oh, if you're old, then you're also diseased, if I may. And that kind of conflation becomes, as you can imagine, quite problematic on the moral plane. Age is a major risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, degenerative diseases of many kinds, osteoarthritis, cirrhosis, certain cancers, as you well know, chronic lung disease, cerebrovascular diseases, congestive cardiac failure, coronary artery disease, etc. And so there is this this pathologization of aging as being a disease that needs to be remedied, right? Because of the conflation that we see. So this is the question that I want you to keep in mind, right? It's actually interesting because I'm not sure it's just a research question. I think it's also a moral and a theological question. Is aging something that we ought to cure? A few more things here, right? Let's just come back to this, that the global anti-aging market, right? And this is always very difficult to estimate because, as you well know, it's hard to say what is included in the anti-aging market. Now, often we think of this as being certain kinds of cosmetics that are used to conceal the signs or the physical signs of aging. So hair products, right, that will color the hair, for instance. Or somebody just asked me recently if I'm going to start using it because I'm graying faster than I was hoping that I would. Anti-wrinkle skin creams, and you name it, right? All of these fall under this market, which was estimated at $64 billion in 2022 and is expected to double that within the next few years. Just because of that, again, that particular what thrust, I think, in the culture around us, right? That says to hide aging, which is a herald of mortality, and nobody wants to be privy to that. Now, this whole idea of wanting to stave off aging and live a longer lifespan is not new, of course, right? As you well know, it's been embedded in most of our cultures. I don't know. Has anyone here ever read the Epic of Gilgamesh? These are ancient texts, some of the most ancient texts actually on the planet. You can Google it, of course. This is the age that we live in. And you can find the tablets there. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a text that was written in Akkadian from ancient Mesopotamia. It was written somewhere between 2000 and 1000 before the Common Era. And in the text, it really is all about a king who is seeking for immortality. And he actually gets upset because he doesn't understand why he, a king who has done much in terms of conquering and victory and accomplishment and so on and so forth, he doesn't understand how it is that he has to taste or has to be stung by immortality, just like his servants and the paupers of his kingdom and so on and so forth. And so it becomes a question of injustice, and he pursues immortality in the text. These other pieces of literature also are looking for that kind of longevity. You know about this perhaps in scripture, right? If you have the chance to read some of the first few chapters of Genesis, you see this whole question of longevity running through the texts. In Genesis 5, that's where you get the what we call the count of the table of nations. You see this language of the generations from Adam to his descendants, who are 900 years old, right? Whatever that might mean, it's hard to say. But then God gets angry in Genesis 6, right? Because of the mixing of the sons of God with the daughters of earth, and of course there's the deluge comes after that. But God gets angry, gets frustrated, and says, he says, "My breath shall not reside in them," right? And he seals the maximum lifespan at 120 years, which, by the way, is the age at which Moses would end up passing away. And then what you end up seeing in the text is people living for 900 years. And then that starts to dwindle as you go through the chapter, as you go through different chapters up to Moses, who lives to 120 years. So you see this kind of this want to live, but then this kind of limitation of longevity, and then the want to regain it with things like, with explorations that you've heard about, Ponce de Leon, the Fountain of Youth, and the Holy Grail and so on and so forth, which is supposed to accord a certain kind of longevity on the one who drinks from the cup and so on and so forth. So this is not new, right? But what's always interesting to me is that there's this sense in ancient texts, as there is today, of an injustice around human infinitude, It's not fair that we die. Especially in the Christian tradition, when we are taught that the highest of our virtues is to love. And so you invest in a life loving others, only for them to no longer be in your life and for you to have to relearn how to live in the world without them. Does that make sense to you? This notion of injustice, right, around human finitude. And even though, I'll go back and read the Epic of Gilgamesh and I'll be like, oh, that's fun. He seemed to have it right about this is not fair. I kind of get that. Now, of course, in the Christian tradition, there is something different about the whole pursuit of longevity because of what we think comes after death, right? And that changes the entire discussion. So let's talk about the transhumanists, right? Let's talk a little bit about transhumanism. So transhumanism is interesting. It's a philosophy, it's a movement that's based on the premise that the human species, our human species in its current form, does not represent the end of our development, but rather a comparatively early phase. And so they will say, and I'm talking about transhumanism in a very general way here, understanding, of course, that there are different stripes of transhumanism, just as it would be difficult for me to, for us to say all Christians believe X and all Christians. We can't make these kinds of generalizations, but since this is an introduction to transhumanist thought, let me dwell in that space for a moment. So it's an intellectual and a cultural movement that affirms the possibility and the desirability of fundamentally improving the human condition through applied reason, especially by developing and making widely available technologies like nanotechnology, neuropharmacology, and the new genetics to eliminate aging. That's almost always pinpointed, and to greatly enhance human intellectual, physical, and psychological capacities, including mood and emotion. Are we good? Do you follow here? So there's this. The desire here is to improve us. In fact, some transhumanist literature will say that it's high time that humans stop leaving our evolution up to nature, capital N, and for us to take the reins into our own hands and move us right into the next kind of phase of things. So that's where we are. So transhumanists will say that it kind of looks like this. That right now, humans have access to this in the world. These are the kinds of experiences that we have access to. It's quite limited because of our limited capacities. Some transhumanists will also say that actually the world of experience is much larger for animals who have different capacities than humans do, flight and so on and so forth. And so they have a larger kind of window of experiences. But that when it comes time for us to transition into this next phase of humanhood, what they call post-humanhood, we'll have capacities that are so kind of wonderful and extensive that our realm of possibility and our realm of experience will be way beyond what we can imagine just now, right? With enhanced cognition and enhanced bodies and enhanced memory and so on and so forth. This is so you'll see this expression, right? We ain't seen nothing yet is kind of the expression that we see often kind of captured by the transhumanist traditions. So kind of in many transhumanists, again, not all, some transhumanists are very, are not as interested in kind of prolonging our human, the human lifespan forever. Some transhumanists will say, listen, we want to kind of eradicate disease and we want to enhance the human being, but not necessarily for us to live 400 years. But then you get other transhumanists who say, no, quite the contrary. We want to eliminate aging altogether because our vision of aging is a deficit model of existence, right? Nobody wants to age and it's awful to get old, to get older. And so that's something we want to eliminate, right, from the kind of the chapters of humanhood. And so some transhumanists are active champions of radical life extension, right, of trying to get humans to live past whatever it is the maximal lifespan might be or whatever our life expectancy might be, wherever we might be on the planet. And sometimes you'll see this in the literature, that one of the primary objectives of transhumanism is to make death a voluntary decision. That's kind of difficult to swallow, but I leave that with you, right? This language of making death a voluntary decision seems to suggest that we need to have control over it. And that's not all that, I think, I don't think that's all that unsurprising, in fact, in the culture in which we live, which is very hyper-functional, and I think in many ways defines progress based on more mastery and more control over the body. And so that seems to be symptomatic of that as well. One famous transhumanist named Ray Kurzweil, perhaps you've heard of him. He's an innovator. He's a well-known kind of mover and shaker in the transhumanist community. He actually won an honorary he's won so many honorary doctorates, I've forgotten the number now. Is it 15 or 18, something like that? He won an honorary doctorate from McGill around the time of one of my graduations. I can't remember if it was my master's or my PhD. And he projects 2045, or he seems to foresee 2045 as the year that humans will finally become immortal. Now, I'm not going to go into his argument because it's quite interesting. I think, Joseph, as somebody who's an expert in computer science, you might enjoy it because there's some of that working through the argument that might be fun for you to take a look at in Time magazine. But when you get a chance, take a look at what he's trying to do. And there is some language around, he's been interviewed on a number of occasions on this. I don't know if he still projects 2045 as being the year of magic when we move into post-humanhood and gain so much more longevity. But we do know that he takes something like, he has said something like he takes something like 100 pills a day, vitamins and minerals and so on and so forth to try to get him there, so that's kind of an interesting motivation to bind the body, And so I think what you do see as arms of transhumanism are these companies that invest in life extension technologies that try to not just stave off aging, but try to make that whole question of death a voluntary decision. Perhaps, have you heard of Alcor? Perhaps you've heard of Alcor out in Arizona, if I remember rightly. It's a cryopreservation company that looks at what they do is they cryopreserve the body. So people who sign up, there are 1,300 plus members just now who have signed up for Alcor. They have 180 what they call cryo patients in these tanks. Right? And what happens is that if you've signed up for this particular service, right after usually cardiac arrest, Alcor is called in, and I'll make this very, very short. They will pump the body they eliminate the blood from the body. They pump the body with cryoprotectants, which allow tissues to be cooled to very low temperatures with little ice formation, right, which can cause all kinds of structural damage. And then the body or the head, depending on which forfait, which plan you've bought, gets stored in one of these tanks. And it seems kind of absurd, but what's interesting about it is that they have a whole argument. Go on their site one day, just take a look at how they talk about the science, and sometimes they address theological things as well. But take a look at how they argue or make claims in this particular area. Because one thing that I think that's really interesting to my students anyway, is the whole notion around the definition of death. And I think in many ways, Alcor is right, that our definition of death is dynamic. It's not static. And depending on the technologies that are accessible to you, our definition of death changes. And Alcor says, if that's the case, then can't we not intercept, right? Can we not put the body on hold, if I may, on pause, until we can figure out how to resuscitate you? And this is why Alcor doesn't call the organisms that are in their tanks, they don't call them cadavers. They call them patients, right? Because the understanding is that they put them on pause. And so there's this want, of course, to get people to live much longer than we actually do, with the elimination of certain diseases and certainly with the elimination of aging as we come through. Now, perhaps the first thing you think about when you see these kinds of projects is this lunacy, right? Is this kind of like really way off the grid? Well, it could be. It depends on how you kind of approach these types of things, right? So let me just give you some context that might make you think twice about these kinds of endeavors, or at least give us some fodder to work with. So the maximum human lifespan, right, that is the maximum age reached by any one member of the human species, has remained pretty fixed at 125 years or so. Interestingly, that correlates quite well with the Genesis account that God seals on humankind. But I'll leave that. And it's been like that for like 100 millennia. But human life expectancy, right? So this life expectancy is the age at which 50% of a given population survive. Now, human life expectancy at birth in the Western world has increased some 27 years over the past century alone. In the past century alone, we have increased our life expectancy by 27 years. The last time we saw an increase to our life expectancy by that amount of time, by 27 years or so, has been the period from ancient Rome to about 1900 of the Common Era. It took that long for us to see a sizable growth in our life expectancy. It took us a century to do that, just as it's late. And so that already shows us some kind of maneuverings in the scientific technological world towards longevity. This whole idea of cryopreservation might make you kind of think twice about, this just seems so far far away from us and so on and so forth. Well, we all know that in the early 1970s, that marked the successful cryopreservation of pre-implanted mammalian embryos. And a decade or so later, the first frozen human embryo was brought to term. This is no longer, as you well know, a new science, but rather quite routine. So since then, the cryopreservation of human embryos, often by the process of vitrification, right? In addition to like gamete and ovarian tissue freezing, has become, I think, a mainstay of reproductive technology. So that whole idea of cryopreservation of Alcor and so on and so forth as being kind of science fiction does not quite fit the bill. And now there are also examples that we look to in nature, as you well know, right? You know how this works. Scientists will often look to the natural world for examples of things that we're studying. And that becomes important. These become important models for us. In nature, for instance, things around issues around longevity and immortality are quite abundant. The wood frog, Rana sylvatica, perhaps you know about this, is a quite remarkable creature found throughout the continent, from the northeastern US into much of Canada, most of Alaska, and even towards the Arctic Circle. It has proved exceedingly useful for studies in cryobiology and longevity at low temperatures. And you can take a look at go online and find videos of this. It's quite cool stuff. At low temperatures, glucose is synthesized in excessive amounts from the frog's liver glycogen, and it's distributed throughout its body, which results in decreased cell shrinkage that's usually caused by osmotic pressure, right? And what happens is that the animal, there's urea that's localized in the cells prior to freezing, and glucose, they kind of serve as cryoprotective agents that keep it from freezing. And studies have shown that the animal can survive the freezing of up to something like 70% of its body water and a minimum body temperature of -6 Celsius. And it can go for uninterrupted freezing for several weeks. And then the spring warmth touches its skin, right? Kind of kisses its skin, and the frog starts to warm and comes back to life, if I may, because it is considered clinically dead. I think that's interesting, right? So in its frozen state, the heart beats something like a few times per minute, and then it ceases altogether, as does pulmonary respiration, as does circulation, muscle contraction. And then when it thaws, physiological function is restored. And cryobiologists turn to that saying, well, wait a minute. Now, granted, we're not frogs, right? Of course, we know that we're not frogs. But the fact that there are these kinds of examples in nature make it an interesting kind of purview, right? And we know that there are billionaires who are pouring all kinds of funding into the pursuit of human longevity, pro-longevity, right? To get us to live way beyond, and not just our life expectancy, but the maximum human lifespan. And we can talk to them, there are all kinds of examples, some a lot less comparable to humankind, of course, but you may have heard of Turritopsis nutricula, which is a kind of jellyfish that by the process of cellular transdifferentiation, it can throw off, right, the process of aging. So what it does is that it moves through a juvenile state to a reproductive state. It reproduces, and then through transdifferentiation, it can revert back to a juvenile state. Right, so kind of like a Benjamin Button or a reverse, whatever that is. Like it starts to get older, and then it reverts back to its younger state, and it keeps going ad infinitum. So it's kind of virtually immortal, but not quite, because a lot of things like to eat the jellyfish, right? So that kind of slows the deal for the immortal jellyfish taking over the earth. That's not going to happen. But there are all kinds of examples, right? I think that we can turn to centenarian studies. As you know, we look towards blue zones, right, to find out what the secret is for those human beings who've lived for 100 years. And as you know, very often they'll say the secret is constant movement, right? Constant investment in things of meaning, activities of meaning. Many people will cite spiritual care or spiritual kind of meaning as being an important part of their longevity, but this is being studied in great, I think, care. Regenerative medicine, transhumanists are all over this, the fact that we can recreate and rebuild organs, because sometimes I think the human body is looked at very mechanistically. It's kind of like a car, right? If something stops working, let's just replace it so that you can keep on living, right? That's the point. Now, the brain is a bit of a trick, but a lot of the other organs, as you well know, there's all kinds of movement in regenerative medicine. Really, really interesting stuff happening, right? In terms of the creation of hearts from stem cells, to the creation of urinary bladders, to the creation of the uterus, and so on and so forth. You know that these are all being worked on in incredible detail, just with incredible progress, whatever that might mean. But at the end of the day, another question that we ask, certainly as Christian ethicists in this area, is, well, wait a minute. If you have a car and you tell me that it's from the 1960s, but then you go and tell me that its engine has been rebuilt, all of its knobs have been changed, the wheels are different, the body is different, and so on and so forth. You've replaced all the parts. Then we ask the question: is it still the same car that you had when you bought in the 19? What is it now with all of these replacements? It's an interesting existential question that we often kind of look at, certainly in the Christian tradition. So I come back to this question, about aging being something that we ought to cure or something that we should avoid or try to get rid of, because transhumanists do not like at all this notion, or they'll call the apathetic idea that we just say, well, it's just part of what it means to be human. And transhumanists will say, who said? Right? And if we can use medicine and technology and science to forfeit that, then we can rewrite what it means to be human. So don't get stuck in that indifference. In fact, you'll get a lot of transhumanist theorists who will say that we just get stuck in this indifference, right? And it's because of our apathy that we find ourselves in a lamentable state of limited capacity. This is kind of the language that we see. Cromwell Crawford, and I'll end with some of this, is a Hindu scholar who has written some interesting books, especially in Hindu bioethics. And he said this that I found kind of interesting for us that we can maybe take into our discussion. But he says, though fears of old age and death are normal, these ancient fears are intensified because we live in a materialistic society that's deprived itself of religion. That's interesting. I think we can have a debate about that. I'm sure some people will disagree with that, to be sure. I think others might kind of shake their head and say, I don't know. Maybe there's something there in terms of especially what religion has to say about immortality. As you well know, for Christians, I think the language is less around what we can do to the body in order for us to live forever. I don't think the Christian traditions will have too much of a problem if, for instance, we develop a pill that can get you to live for 500 years. Because 500 years is kind of a drop in the bucket compared to the eternity that is promised in our tradition, right? But there is this language in the Christian traditions around, well, what do you have to do to the body in order for it to live for so long? Because we have issues with that, right? Tampering with the body in certain ways. And so there is a limitation there to body modification. That's a problem to us, I think. So let me just end by asking some of these questions that can maybe help with our discussion, or maybe after the talk today, you can mull over while you're laying in bed tonight in the dark, thinking about some of these deep questions that we ask as Christian bioethicists, to be sure. So that first one I've already asked. It's, when does a quantitative change become a qualitative one? In other words, if we were to lift the number of years to our living, and we're not, and transhumanists will make this plain, they're not just looking at mathematically adding 20 more years, 50 more years, 100 more years to the lifespan just to say that we can live for 200 years. They want to add more years to the health span, they'll say, right? Because nobody wants to live for 800 years, of which 600 are, you're ill for 600 of those years, for instance. So it's adding to the health span. But Christians will ask, well, wait a minute, what are you doing to the body in order to get that kind of change, right? And in adding so many years to the body, what does it do to the human? What has it done to humanhood, for instance, that we've gone from, life expectancy of 30 years to 80 years? And let's be reminded, certainly in questions of justice and access, that some of my colleagues on the Pontifical Academy for Life, right, at the Vatican, who are from different places in the world, I think especially the global south, this whole language around getting us to live to 100 years, 300 years, 500 years, for them, they'll often turn to me and say, Cory, we're just trying to get our people to live to 50 years because the life expectancy is under that. 2 other questions I'll leave you with. Is there meaning in a world without human limitation? So transhumanists are constantly trying to overcome the limitations of humanhood in terms of our capacities that they feel are absolutely lamentable and that we should apply science and technology to rectify. The question is there something about being limited that we need to conserve or need to preserve? I think that's an interesting question for us in the sciences. In other words, is there value to limitation, or is there value to being finite and mortal? Does that make sense? Let me leave it there then.
All right, great. Thank you, Cory. Electra?
Actually, just your last point there about the value and the finitude is like if there's like some kind of dictator in the world, it's in my mind like, oh, at least they won't live forever, So limit to him, and maybe as he dies, his followers might need to wait a while to kind of cling on to some other dictator. That's it.
Yeah, that's a great point, Electra. And in fact, transhumanists, if you ever get the chance, I always say, if you ever get the chance, as if any of us have so much free time, but if you go on to the transhumanist kind of movement has a flagship website called Humanity Plus. And on the website, there's an FAQ. That's like that's like their sacred text. They would be upset if I use the word sacred, but that's like their sacred text. And in there, they actually address this question, Electra, about, well, what if the Hitlers, for instance, were living for 800 years? Because guess who's going to live for so long? It's the people who will be able to afford whatever technology we need in order to live for so much longer. It's not going to be people with less affluence. It's not going to be the Gandhis of the world, for instance, right? Yeah. And it'll be the Hitlers. It'll be the, name the dictator and so on and so forth, which would make for probably the end of human civilization as we know it, if that's the kind of trend, if I may. And of course, the transhumanists will say, yes, but we could have had Beethoven for a few more years. And we could have had Jesus for a few more. I don't think they use Jesus, actually, which is interesting. But, we could have had all these other people. Mother Teresa's around for a few more years. So, and I'm kind of like, so I'm like you, Electra. I'm like, yeah. Who may have been exterminated, if they, so it's just an interesting kind of conversation, because it almost seems to be almost very, very romanticized. Living forever. Yeah. Why would you not want that? Yes, but... And this is what you're doing, Electra. You certainly are reading it through a Christian lens, if I may, saying, hold on, there are some justice issues here. Let's just stop for a moment and say, what does that mean? Because if you want people to live forever, then we're going to have to think about questions of access. Therefore, it should be open to me as it should be open to the dictators and so on and so forth. And if that's the case, what does that mean? And is it okay if we restrict access to certain peoples based on their morality? Now imagine that, right? Some kind of tribunal that judges whether or not you should be able to take the longevity pill, if I may. Yeah, great point, Doctor.
Maria.
Yeah, so great talk first. And then, so 2 things. One thing I was thinking about during the talk, and the other I'm thinking about more with Electra's question. So the first thing is what I mentioned in the chat is I really like Tolkien's take on, it's not ageism per se, it's more like immortality. So the elves are immortal, but the gift of man is mortality. And then for many, like for all generations, this gift is perceived as a curse. But then Tolkien goes on to explain that even the powers or the elves or like the greatest people will kind of feel like jealous of men because they can leave the world, so they won't be burdened, because you will also need to consider this spiritual beyond the body,
right?
Like the burden of a long existence. So the elves, like they see things moving around them, but they don't care anymore.
Mm-mm-mm-mm. Yeah,
And
yeah,
so this is also one thing to consider, I guess. The other thing, yeah, it's accessibility and the value of human life. Um, because, yeah, as we see that, as we have been saying in the past few days, at least those who are following the Middle East news, there is sub-zero value for human life. And I would have a more pessimistic view of this, that the ones who will profit of it are the billionaires and people who have access. And if it's going to be a morality test, who's going to set the morality test?
yeah,
Because according to some people, killing other people is quite moral. So
mm,
the ones who set the morality test will set it so that they pass
yeah,
and
yeah.
people like them pass. It's not going to be so that your everyday person passes.
Yeah, and that, Maria, has been the history of. So I do a lot of my work is on the concept of personhood, right? And that's the history of according personhood to some humans and not others, right? And who makes the accord, right? Who decides who counts in the protected category of persons? Well, people who have those criteria, white males and so on and so forth, who will say those who are outside the category are people who don't have the same criteria as us, right? That's a great point, and that's exactly what some theorists will talk about in terms of critiques. But I do love this, coming back to the gift of mortality, right? Tolkien, as you well know, a good Christian scholar, right? Now I'll leave that behind. Of course, Lord of the Rings, the trilogy, and so on and so forth. But there's something beautiful about that whole idea of the gift of mortality that you see in Scripture, of course, right? The language of Job and others, right, who will talk exactly about that. One of I think the most beautiful lines, if you read the Scripture in terms of how it looks at aging, it's quite ambivalent, right? Sometimes you see this lingering. Right, this idea of aging as lingering is something that we do not want because you want to be with God, that notion. And then you see the flip side of the gray hair as being a crown of God's glory, God's crowning of his people, right? Because if you lived to a certain age, well, you've done something, right? To have done that more than others have. There's also that language that I love in Scripture around, one of God's greatest blessings on his people throughout the Testaments is being accorded a life that is not just long, but full of days, right? So it's not really a question of deep longevity. It's a life that's well lived. I don't want to say cliche, but that's very biblical, right? So not so much the length, but the fullness of days, right? That I think biblical wisdom brings to all of this. One more thing, I don't want to keep it. There's so much wisdom in what you're asking, Maria. So we can do a whole, we can talk for 3 hours about it, and we can after mass. We can after mass on Sunday. But what's interesting about this, the language of the spiritual development, transhumanists, I've read some transhumanists who are very anti-religion, who have said, listen, people of faith, how would you not want to live many more years to invest in your spiritual development? Think of how much more reconciliation you can commit to, how many more virtuous deeds you can commit to. And you're kind of like, no, but it's not like there's a tally in our tradition where God says, how many did you do? How many virtuous things? Wonderful, you get in, right? Although there is the language of good morality and the perfection of virtue in our tradition that makes this a very interesting conversation, right? Now you can flip that around and say, yes, many more years means spiritual development. It can also mean the opposite, right? That you linger in those years, but I leave that there.
Yeah. Another 2 points, if no one else has questions. So I was also thinking of the way that when you were talking, like how society views aging people, and actually I see people who are of certain ages, like in the Western societies, as way more accomplished, and like sometimes when you reach 40 or 50, it's like now it's time to start something new. Whereas in lots of the Middle Eastern, at least, society, it would be like, oh, now your kids are married, like you're old, your life is over at maybe 40 or 50. And it's not everyone, but it's a trend there. And then after that, what many people do is that they find value in helping their children raise their children. So like in the multi-generational homes, like families, big families living next to each other and all of that. And so I'm going from my first point to the other, which is like the old people aren't as much of a burden because they help around the house also. So like they would do babysitting, they would teach the grandchildren skills that their parents don't have time to. And my friend who is also living in China doing, when she was doing her PhD there, she was telling me like it's practically the grandchildren raising the grandparents raising the children, because the parents are working all the time. And this kind of confers this value on the older generation that an individualistic society in the West has forgotten, I think. Yeah, like having someone old, like the wise, the head of the family, like the leader of the family, even if he's 90 years old, it's his word that will work, that goes, that works. And it's the same for matriarchs. Like it's not just patriarchs, it's the same if it's a matriarch. Even if she's 90, even if she's 95, like at least if they still have their wit, at least. But even then, it's a value that is being lost, I think, in the very individualistic society here.
Yeah, I think that's right, Maria. John Paul II in his day wrote a letter to the elderly in 1999. And regardless of your confessions, if you have the time to read it, it's actually quite a beautiful letter. And he wrote it when he himself was of a certain age, was suffering from Parkinson's, was suffering from, so was not writing this as a romanticized, in some kind of romanticized ideal. And he talks about the value of intergenerationality, right? Not just the person of age as being a repository of wisdom, but this interesting notion that we have in the Christian traditions about there being innovation in intergenerationality, right? That there's still creation that happens. And in fact, some cultures will even say, what you've just said here, Maria, is that at the end, longevity and even immortality can be thought of in terms of intergenerationality. That is, as the grandparent teaches values and so on and so forth to one generation, and then they pass through or they pass on, for instance, there is a certain kind of life that moves through. This is actually a very important way of understanding legacy and immortality in Judaism and in other traditions like in Islam and in Christianity, that understands that, yes, there is immortality to think about in terms of post-mortem, in terms of death, after death with God, and so on and so forth. That is well known in the resurrectionist traditions. But there's also this notion of leaving a certain seal, right, on humankind. And there are, that's the whole point of kind of teaching the generations that kind of linger after us in terms of leaving my mark, not just biologically, because I have that too. My children carry my genes, but there's a legacy that passes through, a different kind of immortality, if I may, that you can seek. Yeah, I think that's great. There's also something, and I think, Maria, this would be interesting, and I'm happy to hear from others as well. And I realize that we're coming, it's already 8:00, but very, very quickly, another important thing to think about in all of this discussion is that pro-longevity is all good and well, right? This want to live a lot longer. But something that's often neglected in these conversations is the environmental impact of living for 300 years, right? If we all live for another 300 years, what is that going to mean? What is that going to mean for procreation? And then you do get certain responses in transhumanist literature will say, well, Cory, don't be concerned about that. Extraterrestrial habitation, right? We're going to find some other planet. We're going to find somewhere else to go that's off the globe and inhabit it. And I was just actually interviewed by a high school student in the US about this exact thing. What do Christians and Catholics think about? What do Catholics think about this whole idea of living on Mars? And I'm like, if the understanding is let's destroy the planet, and since we've done so terribly, now let's just move to another one and do the same, that's going to be a bit of a problem for Christians who believe that humans were made from the earth for the earth. And so we have to think about the longevity kind of scenario, right, that binds on environmental impact. But I'll leave it there in case there is more to go.
I think wars will take care of that.
Can I do 2 comments and ask you a question? I kind of like the idea. I won't say it that way. Things that are finite actually are precious, because you only have them for a while, and then they're kind of gone. And you raised this thing before, you called it the definition of death, Like, can you elaborate on that? Like, what, you know?
So yeah, I mean, I agree with this, Joseph, right? This understanding of the finite being precious, right? That there is a certain grasping, right? That happens because of the finiteness of life. Now, I think transhumanists are, that whole want to kind of extend life, I think makes so much more sense, in fact, when we are stung by grieving. As soon as we lose someone, suddenly I'm like, you know what? I'll take the pill, right? So as my mom was dying, I would have been ready to infuse, right? Absolutely, I would have been able. I thought that. My father died when he was 30. I'm guaranteed people around him would have forced the pill down his throat so that he would continue living. For those of us who have, who know the sting of losing a child, for instance, and that's not just a sting, of course, but who know the pain and the trauma of losing a child, guaranteed there are thoughts about injustice around around mortality and around maybe the too fleetingness of life, right? Why is some life more fleeting and then others live to 98? Like there's that language in it all. And yes, it puts a premise kind of on the preciousness of life. That certainly is something that we see because it's so precarious. And this is true, right? And we can't dwell in that space either. I can't dwell in the space that maybe tomorrow one of my children will get sick. I can't think of that. I can't dwell in that space, right? And so that language of the precarity of life kind of keeps us on our toes and does make us think twice about, hugging someone a little longer, for instance, right? There is that preciousness that I may lose you at any moment. So let me be reminded of that if it's going to enhance my love for you, for instance, that kind of motif. The whole idea of the definition of death has always really interested me, because some people that definition changes, right? Read about the Harvard definition of death, the cardiorespiratory definitions of death, brain death, and so on and so forth. These things change, right? As humans are able to do certain things with technology and science. And very often people will encapsulate the definition of death as the irreversible integrated function. That is, the organism as a whole can no longer return to a certain kind of integrated function, right? That kind of wholeness of an organism. But as you know, a lot of these definitions kind of change. And what some transhumanists will say, yeah. And because it can change at any whim because of the way we develop our technology, let's keep developing our technology, right? To stave death off, to change the definition so that when you pass away, if I may, from a cancer or from cardiovascular disease, well, let's arrest the process or put you on pause, like that Alcor case, because the definition of death may change as we get new technologies in place. Perhaps we'll be able to resurrect you. Now, they won't use the language of resurrect. It's resuscitate, because you're considered to be a patient. You have not just died yet, right? You just put on pause. But that language of death, I think, is always interesting to us because it is malleable. It is, in some ways, if I may, technologically dependent.
All right. So I'd like to thank Cory for being here. And this was such a rich conversation. I was almost ready to say, okay, let's pray, but we'll end the talk, and let's thank Cory.